The situation in the region, and particularly in the Gaza Strip, has reached a horrendous moment, given the numbers of casualties and the enormity of suffering. I would like us all to take a few seconds of silence, remembering the souls that we lost, and sending positive vibes to those still alive under horrific conditions. Let's have a moment of silence, please. Thank you. Thank you. You have an exquisite panel of educators in an educational institution discussing a moment of unprecedented proportions of brutality and violation of international law. The appropriate reaction is for anyone to be enraged, angry, appalled, and the list can go on with all the emotional, passionate adjectives. But because we have the privilege of being in one of the best educational institutions in the region, AUC, and because we have the privilege of having some of the best educators in the region, I would like to invite you in the coming hour and a half to take advantage of these two facts, to educate ourselves about some basic fundamentals that make the cause of the Palestinian people a just cause. Let's educate ourselves in the coming hour and a half about some fundamentals of the justness of this cause throughout its history, and what I really, really want us all to spend a lot of our energy on is, what do we do about this cause and its future? Because it has been proven to anyone who likes to see the light that this situation is untenable and should not go on. As educators in an educational institution of excellence, we owe it to ourselves to understand the fundamentals and say, how can we be smart using those fundamental facts to move forward, hopefully with strategies that are informed and will lead to constructive realities for the people over there. That is the objective of today's conversation. I will say one final moment. This is a moment like no other moment because the Israeli caused such outrage that has become a global issue. The Palestinian cause is no longer a regional issue only. It's now a global issue that enrages people across the world, and that really shows that there is something fundamentally wrong with the international global order. This is what we will discuss today, and we want you to help us together move forward. Where do we move from here forward? I have the pleasure of being on this panel, only moderating it. I already took too much time. On this panel with Dr. Ibrahim Awad, Dr. Hani Sayed, Dr. Nisreen Badawi, and Dr. Jason Beckett. All are renowned, world-class experts in international organizations and international law. I'll start us off with Dr. Ibrahim Awad. Each one of our speakers will take 10 minutes, and then we'll open up for your questions and your remarks. Over to you, Dr. Ibrahim.
Thank you very much, Dean Noha. And I'd like to thank you twice. First, that you mentioned that this is about international law and international organization, because I'm an intruder among international lawyers, because I'm a friend of international lawyers, an amateur international lawyer. And second, because you placed the issue within governance and global governance. This is where I would like also to place this issue. The title of our event is International Law and the Struggle of the Palestinian People. I think we can also look at it as international law, international organization, and the frustration of the Palestinian struggle. The history of Israel has been history, the existence and the behavior of Israel has been very closely linked to the governance of the international system, and specifically to the international intergovernmental organization of this system. I'm not saying a specific organization. I'm saying how the system is organized and was organized. I was asked to do some history. In 1922, even before 1922, with the adoption of the Covenant of the League of Nations, Article 22 was introduced. Article 22 was about the system of mandates. System of mandates, three categories or three levels of mandates. Palestine, along with Iraq, along with Syria, along with Lebanon, were placed under the mandates of Britain and France, Mandate A. So this was a consecration in international law of the mandate idea. Following that, in 1922, an agreement is made between the United Kingdom, between Britain on the one hand, and the Council of the League of Nations with regard to the mandate over Palestine. And in this agreement, it is clearly said that the mandatory is tasked to create the conditions for the establishment of a Jewish national home in Palestine. So the promise given by Balfour in 1917 does not have, in fact, any weight in international law. But the Allies meet in 1920, and then they have the idea consecrated in international law in an agreement under international law. This is the start of the frustration of the Palestinian struggle and the help provided to the efforts towards the success of the project of the Zionist movement, and then with the establishment of the state of Israel. In 1937, after the revolt, Palestinian revolt in 1936, a British commission recommends the partition of Palestine. 10 years later, the British announced that they are withdrawing. The mandate comes to an end. They are withdrawing in May 1948. Upon which the United Nations, new, nascent, young, established a United Nations Special Commission on Palestine, which comes up with two proposals: the proposal of the majority and the proposal of the minority. The proposal of the majority was for the partition of Palestine, along the lines of the report of the Peel Commission. The minority that rejects this partition, 3 countries, interestingly: India, Iran, and Yugoslavia. The recommendation of the Special Commission goes to the General Assembly, and General Assembly adopts the resolution. I recognize that I did not know the conditions under which the resolution was adopted in 1947, this month, 29th of November. It was adopted in 3 minutes. The resolution on the partition of Palestine was adopted in 3 minutes. Someone submitted the resolution. The resolution was voted upon, and it was adopted. I have here I don't have the time to read which countries voted for and which countries voted against, but just to signal how lightly the question was issued. The resolution did not create the state of Israel. The resolution recommended partition. State of Israel was declared on the 14th of May 1948. The Arabs abstained, refrained from declaring their own state because they were not in agreement with the idea of the partition. They had already rejected it in 1937. They had not even met with the Peel Commission. I will, because of the time constraint, I will jump to 1967. 1967, well, you can even say another resolution, 194, adopted by the General Assembly, and Israel does not recognize it, does not implement it. It is the resolution on the return of refugees or compensation for the refugees who are not willing to return. They don't apply it. 1967, resolution of the Security Council, Israel, demanding the withdrawal of Israel from Arab-occupied territories in 1967. Israel does not apply it. 1973, another resolution, Security Council, reaffirming the resolution of 1967 is not applied. And you have resolution after resolution that are not applied, or draft resolutions that are submitted but not adopted in Security Council because of the United States exercising its right of veto. Which brings us to the war in Gaza. I just wanted to place what is happening in the context of the history of how Israel dealt with international organization, how Israel dealt with global government. There is nothing new, in fact, nothing new in what is happening today. So in these last 2 weeks, 4 draft resolutions were submitted to the Security Council, first by Russia, second by Brazil, and then third 2 drafts by the United States and Russia again. The first one is vetoed by Russia and China, the U.S. resolution, and then you have the Brazilian resolution. very, very interesting resolution. But it calls for a humanitarian ceasefire, immediate humanitarian ceasefire. It is vetoed by the United States. The option was to go to the General Assembly under a resolution adopted in 1950 when Security Council cannot take action on a certain dispute. The membership can go to the General Assembly. The General Assembly meets, and Jordan submits a draft resolution, which it negotiates. Jordan does not cling to its text. It is because it wants it to be adopted by as many states as possible, and the resolution is adopted. The resolution is adopted by 121 states against 14. And again, who votes against? The United States, Israel, 4 members of the European Union, and a number of states, 2 states from Latin America, and a number of states from the South Pacific. It's clear where international society is clearly 121, 45 abstention from different regions, and these 14, it's clear where the international society is. My idea is that Israel efforts for the creation of Israel were pushed, and then the partition was recommended in an international system that was different to the current international system. The current international system, at least the membership of the United Nations, you have 193 member states. At that time, you had 50 and something member states in 1949. It was a club of former colonial, still colonial at that time, colonial countries and new colonial countries. These are the states that recommended the partition and that gave their support to the creation of Israel. I think the creation of Israel is not now in question. Israel is there. However, the issue now is what are the conditions for the presence of Israel in the region, how the presence of Israel in the region could not once and again and again and again result in instability, result in frustrating all efforts at development possible in the region. The lack of justice towards the Palestinians means that the Palestinians resist and will resist. The question is, you can resist and lapse into violence. This is violence against civilians is absolutely regretted and denounced. But the violence, in fact, does not start with bullets. This violence starts with denying the conditions of a dignified, normal living for the Palestinians. This is violence. Depriving the Palestinian people from water, forget about now. The encroachment on the land of the Palestinian people, besieging Gaza for 16 years. This is violence itself, and the Palestinian people retort with violence, and then we have, unfortunately, civilians that are victims of. This is, I think, the message that the Secretary General of the United Nations wanted to convey by saying we have to place this in the context of what happened. So it's interesting to see how the votes are distributed among groups, but I will stop here and thank you very much for kindly listening.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ibrahim, for helping us to go to the origins, the genesis, not only of the state, of Israel, but of the international community in the post-World War era. That was one of the many incidences where it was acting as an international community, and then helping us compare that moment of Genesis with the moment of today, the international community. The situation is a situation within an international community, and Dr. Ibrahim helped us get a snapshot of those two moments of 48 and today. We continue with Dr. Hani, something that Dr. Ibrahim started us off with, which is if you want to expand the definition of violence beyond a bullet shot, regrettably, at a civilian, on whichever that civilian is and what nationality they hold, expand the definition of violence the way Dr. Ibrahim said, to include violence of discriminating against people's fundamental rights to access to all sorts of things, from land to water, et cetera, that takes us into the history and the mapping of Israel's governance practices. Dr. Hani Sayed will take us through this journey, again, to help us focus on some fundamental facts about this case. Over to you, Dr. Hani.
Thank you, Dr. Anouha, and thank you all for being here. It's certainly a difficult time to speak or even to find emotional and rational peace to reflect on what's going on. I'm going to get right to it. The first important thing you need to know if you want to understand what's happening in Gaza and in the West Bank is that ultimately it's about space. So please study maps. This is a very important starting point for anything you need to do and know about what's happening there. I put this map because it's to give you a perspective about what are we talking about. Gaza is 41 kilometers long, 10 kilometers width, which means that by the time you reach IKEA in Cairo Festival City, Gaza will already be over. And by the time you reach Mohandisin, Gaza will already be over. Meaning that that's the space that we're talking about. 2 million people being put in that place, 2 million people being bombed in that place, and understanding what is your spatial awareness and comparing it to the spatial awareness of people who live in Gaza is actually a very important starting point to understand what's going on beyond what you will see on TV. International law has a very bad reputation these days. A genocide is being televised. And the exchange of argument bits of justification and condemnation is actually almost impertinent. But also, from my perspective as an international lawyer, devoted significant part of my life studying the discipline and its history, I'm also very viscerally aware that international law is historically and structurally implicated in the legitimation of settler colonialism in 1948, in the consecration of an apartheid regime since 1967, and in reproducing a logic of territorial nationalism in which we understand the world as divided into territorial national states. That idea has built into it the possibility of ethnic cleansing and genocide. So I have no high illusions about international law, and whenever I hear arguments of justification and condemnation, I really think it's impertinent, and I even sometimes try to resist the temptation to be drawn into telling you this is illegal and this is legal. International law is structurally indeterminate, and for every rule there is an exception, and for every argument there is a counter-argument. And when the argument's over, there will be more people dead. So what can we do about international law? How do we actually can think about this? Because I do think still it's a very important medium to reason about this. And if we just, neutralize certain assumptions that what we expect from law, and we focus less on what we think the law ought to do, and trying to understand what law is doing and how law is doing it, that actually would be an important starting point. So if we start thinking that international law is a structured medium to engage in political struggles, and as such, it is inherently incapable of providing answers to political questions. International law is a medium, meaning that it is by design. It's supposed to be a tool for people who are entering with each other in political struggles. And it's one of the tools. It's not that it's something that actually is going to determine or give you finality. And this medium, this tool, it's designed to be captured, it's designed to be manipulated, it's designed to be appropriated in the context of political struggles. And this medium, however, is structured in the sense that it does not mean that to say that everybody is manipulating it, that you could say whatever you want using the legal language. Certain arguments will certainly not bite. And so you have to always try to turn your positions in order to fit the parameters and the grammar of this language that you're using. In the same way, you have to write a sentence grammatically correctly if you want to be understood. And because of that, if we start from that understanding, then we need to ask the question, so what can we do with law? And what does it mean that it's incapable of providing answers to political questions? When we think about law and the Palestinian issue, I want us to distinguish between three very different questions. They are logically independent, meaning the answer to the one does not dictate necessarily the answer to the other, but they are very implicated and related to each other. There's a question of the justice of the cause. International law does not give you a good reason for why the Palestinian issue is just. For a long time, international law justified racial domination, justified colonial administration, and even in countries where slavery was a legal institution. So you can't actually rely on a legal judgment to understand why the Palestinian cause is just. This is what it means when I say that international law cannot determine political questions. International law does not give you an answers about the ethics of resistance. How do we struggle? Is it violence? Is it non-violence? And everything in between. Why? Because what we call international humanitarian law is ultimately, from my perspective, which is very realist and pragmatist, is basically the rules that determine the distribution of the permission to kill. What is international humanitarian law? Is the body of law that distributes the permission to kill. Usually, killing another person is a crime if we are in a state of peace. But in war, the point is under what conditions you could kill somebody and get away with it. Okay? So, of course, how you distribute the privilege to kill will determine a great deal of actually who end up having a higher or an upper hand in a battlefield. If you say that only states can use force and can kill, then anybody who's resisting states is by definition excluded from that permission. But again, that doesn't give us the answer of what do you do if you are struggling against racial domination. That is a political question by definition, and you have to understand that the justice of your cause does not give you ethically the justification to pursue whatever means of resistance. Your means of resistance have to be somehow informed by the kind of society and emancipatory project that you're trying to build. The war in Gaza is a war against colonial rule. It's about racial domination. And if you want to fight that, you have to fight it in the same spirit, not to reproduce colonial rule and racial domination, but to actually imagine a new world. The third political question that the law does not answer is, how do you know when you won? What are the normative visions for a just solution? Again, if you think that a two-state solution is the way to understand a just solution, we have to understand that this vision is actually historically contingent. The idea that nations are allocated to states is actually not a very old idea. It's almost 100 years, no more. And there is actually ways of imagining just solutions that doesn't start from the assumptions of national territorial law. War is not my profession. It's not our profession in this university. Our profession as educators and as academics is to reimagine the real. Is to actually ask questions in these moments of crisis, ask radical questions that actually expand and push our political horizons. What can we do with law? We could use law to actually draw a map of power relations. We could use legal analysis to point out a weakness in the system and hack systems of control. And we could use legal discourse also in symbolic legitimation struggles in localized setting. These are familiar maps. It tells us something about the development of Israeli rule, and this is between 1948 and 1967. It's very important to understand that when we're thinking about governance of the West Bank and Gaza, we need not to think of the West Bank and Gaza as separate territorial units. The governance of the West Bank and Gaza followed a governance mentality that is not different from the governance mentality that actually decided the state-building project of Israel since 1948. Okay? It's very important to understand that. Now, sometimes Israel used property law, civil property law, to create dispossession and domination. And sometimes it used the law of occupation in international human rights law. It doesn't matter what are the legal tools that you use. Sometimes it's tax law, sometimes it's administrative, zoning, whatever. It doesn't matter. The point is to actually have a particular system of control and governance that has continuity between 1948 until now. This system can be best described as ethnocracy. A good definition by Oren Yaftachel, who's an Israeli geographer. It's a regime that facilitates the expansion, ethnicization, and control of a dominant ethnic nation, often termed the charter or titular group, over contested territory and polity. This way of governing is not unique to Israel. It's not unique to Israel. If you want to understand anything about the history of the United States, about the history of Canada, about the history of Australia, about the history of New Zealand, it's a settler colonial project. And Israel, in that sense, is just an example of a much larger and historically very nefarious model. In this system of control, ethnocracy, the two important categories that you should track every single time you look at a map is the relationship between demography and territory. It's the control of people and the dispossession of territory. And if you run out of territories, the question is, what do you do with people? And we will see that this interaction between the control of demography and the control of territory is actually going to be a determining factor in understanding what's happening in the West Bank and Gaza. No matter how the system changed, since 1948 until now, there is a particular way of understanding governance in West Bank and Gaza, but also inside the Green Line. It's a governance matrix in which the distinction between, the ethnic distinction between Israelis and Palestinians is actually destiny. If you are born a Palestinian, that determines everything that is going to happen to you from beginning of your life until it ends. And if you are an Israeli, that also determines your destiny and what is it that you can and you cannot do. And the other distinction, which is more of a distinction of opportunity, is a distinction between military issues and civilian issues. And the Israeli regime has always oscillated using that distinction opportunistically, depending on the circumstances of the moment. So there are sometimes expropriation of land becomes a military issue for military necessity reasons, and sometimes it's a civilian issue because we are entrusted with governing state land and therefore we have to put our hands on it. That is a distinction of opportunity. But the distinction between between Israelis and Palestinians is a question of destiny, what you become. And that actually you could trace all throughout the development of the settlement process in the West Bank and Gaza. You could see that there are different justifications, different ideas about why to settle and what to settle and where to settle, and even different actors to do it. I'm not going to go through the table because it is actually an entire lecture on its own. I just want to show that even despite those differences, going from settling for security reasons to settling for ideological reasons to settling as a suburbanization project. Just the same way people who move to Palm Hills, people move to the settlement because it's tax incentives, because it's bigger homes, etc., etc. Settlement is a continuous process, irrespective of justification. And again, it's about the relationship between the control of territory and the control of people. Oslo. A lot of people, when they speak about Oslo, they think about it as a moment of interruption. But I always like to bring to the thing to understand what is the actual bargain of Oslo, and why is it's not, in fact, it's not an interruption of this process. So these are actual quotes from an exchange of letters that happened before September 13, 1993, when they shook hands in the White House. It's an exchange of letters between Yasser Arafat and Ishaq Rabin. And you see that the terms of the bargain are striking. It's Arafat saying, I recognize the right of Israel to exist and live in peace and security. It's a major, major, major recognition from the PLO. And in exchange, Ishaq Rabin gets to say, well, thank you, I recognize you as a representative of the Palestinians. The quality and the balance of the bargain doesn't even work anymore. So, maps. The first Oslo divided and consecrated a territorial regime that was actually very important in understanding what's going on now and how it evolved. It divided the West Bank and Gaza into three different areas: Area A, Area B, Area C. Area A include the major Palestinian demographic centers, and these are actually under civilian control by the Palestinians and a minor security control, meaning police law and order, local police law and order by the Palestinian Authority. Area B is actually a shared control, and it includes all the agricultural lands that are related to the Palestinian demographic centers. And these are civilian control over the people by the Palestinian Authority, but the overall security control is for the Palestinians. And then finally, Area C, which is everything other than those territories, which also include the territories of the settlement. Just look at the map and see how actually is the division in terms of percentages about what is it that you get out of Oslo. And this map is not, it's consecrated a system of governance that already exists there by 1993. The distinction between civilian rule and military rule, but also the distinction about how you govern Palestinians and how you govern people that are other than Palestinians. And we cannot understand it without putting it in this larger context of, you know, ethnic domination. After the Intifada, that same narrative continued in terms of fragmentation and encirclement of Palestinian populations, including the construction of the separation barrier, but also the disengagement from Gaza. At the end, in 2015, if you look at this map, this is what you have in terms of how territory is divided. And you see here what's happening. That for a long time, Israel was in the project of expanding control over territory and, you know, abdicating control over civilians. That was the project from the beginning, but then soon Gaza became a demographic problem, not a territorial problem. There's too many Palestinians in Gaza that I'm not going to even try to take the land. But the West Bank was always a territorial and a demographic problem. But after the succession of fragmentation, the West Bank became also a demographic problem. So the way to govern is exactly the same way you govern Gaza, by encircling, by imprisoning. So if you want to understand what's happening in the West Bank and Gaza since 1967 until now, you have to, we can describe it as a Gazification, in which what's happening in Gaza is not an exceptional. The encirclement, the prison is not an exception. It's actually the template to govern over Palestinians. Is this an apartheid? Until 1993, yes. Really. After 1993, it's something else. And I'm not saying apartheid, I'm not saying it's not some apartheid in order to diminish it. I'm saying it's much worse than apartheid. Apartheid, if you understand it as a system of inhumane treatment where you separate people and you dominate them, that actually was the case between 1967 and 1993. It was apartheid then, with labor movements and using the Palestinian demographic populations as a reserve of labor. After 1993, we are actually entering into a different time. Genocide has started in 1993. The fact that people are put in circles is just like people being shipped to a place where they are imprisoned in a ghetto before they are shipped to the camps. So when people say genocide, they need to actually say this with the heavy heart of history, and it actually means a lot. And it's something that we cannot take very lightly or pretend as if it's business as usual. This genocide is being televised, and we need to actually understand how it was produced and try to work together to imagine horizons where actually the solution to a problem is not by expelling people and ethnic cleansing, but try to imagine a future where actually a democratic, equal relationship between people is possible. I'm sorry I spoke for too long. Thank you.
I thank Dr. Hani for helping us understand that what happens in Gaza is actually a deep problem of failed, unjust, from apartheid to genocidal governance. It's a much wider issue that allows us now to listen to two experts of international law and ask them, so do we have tools of dealing with this unaccountable governance that has resulted in such misery for so many people?
Thank you, Dean Noha. I would like to start by thanking my teacher who introduced me to legal indeterminacy for saving me the time to get into that, and for giving us a brilliant presentation of the situation in the Palestinian territories. What I'm going to talk about today are the possible tools that might be available at our disposal and that might also be limiting in terms of attempting to hold Israel accountable for its actions in the Palestinian territories, including in the Gaza Strip, as well as questions of state responsibility and accountability of third states. But before I get into that, I want to assert that international law neither shields perpetrators of atrocities from accountability, nor does it create a clear mechanism for holding them to account. As a matter of fact, it is embedded with the tools to do both. It is embedded with the tools that may be activated by the powerful to give international law teeth and punitive measures, but at the same time, grant them the space and the mechanism to assert state sovereignty, ambiguity of the law, or lack of factual certainty, or enforcement mechanisms. And that's what we're going to look at today, that duality and the existence of the two paths parallel to each other and how one can possibly navigate them and the limits of that navigation. To do that, I'm going to focus on primarily three areas that are reflective, that are often seen as reflective of obligations that are not only owed to those who are subjected to your violations of international law, but potentially owed to the international community as a whole, a category often referred to as erga omnes obligations in international law. And those will include the right to self-determination, and I will also talk about the obligation to respect international humanitarian law with a focus on the question of proportionality. And then finally, I'll talk about the mechanisms that might be established by the Genocide Convention in order to hold the State of Israel to account. On the question of self-determination and the principles of international humanitarian law, the International Court of Justice asserted in an advisory opinion, which is a non-binding opinion issued by the court at the request of the General Assembly on the legality of the separation wall, that Palestinians enjoy a right to self-determination, which it declared to be, along with the principles of international humanitarian law, to enjoy an erga omnes character, that it described as irreproachable and intransgressible, respectively. The court actually asserted in that situation that given the nature of those rights, the international community was under the obligation not to render aid or assistance in maintaining the situation created by such construction. It is also for all states, it continues, while respecting the United Nations Charter and international law, to see to it that any impediment resulting from the construction of the wall to the exercise by the Palestinian people of its right to self-determination is brought to an end. In addition, all the states parties to the Geneva Convention relative to the protection of civilian persons in times of war of 12 August 1949 are under an obligation, while respecting the UN Charter and international law, to ensure compliance by Israel with international humanitarian law as embodied in the Convention. I'll come back to what those obligations actually mean later. But before we look at that, we need to look at those two rights or obligations that are asserted here. We need to look at the question of self-determination and respect for international humanitarian law. On the right of self-determination, one might find a relief to hear the seemingly unambiguous forms with which the court has approached the right to self-determination, a right that is often asserted to be applicable to colonial peoples, irrespective of their political preparedness for statehood. However, as noted by other scholars, we see, after the Cold War, we see a shift in the understanding of the right to self-determination towards an earned sovereignty approach, where it's no longer understood as a right that you're entitled to, but a shift and a detour towards the civilizational requirements of good governance and proving your worthiness of governing yourself. And that shift allows the State of Israel and the international community to dilute the right to self-determination of its contents and to require the Palestinian Authority or the Palestinian peoples, to speak more broadly, to prove their ability to govern themselves. Similarly, and without delving into extensive details about international humanitarian law, so many provisions and customary rules can be recalled about the targeting of hospitals, schools, and refugee camps. But the matter boils down to one of the most absurd yet widely asserted rules of international law, the principle of proportionality, which requires that in the planning of an attack, the military advantage must outweigh the anticipated and not the actual civilian loss. Now, the absurdity of this calculation can never be overstated. not just because it accepts the loss of human life, but that it quantifies human loss, but because it compares the incomparable. In doing that, we're expected to say that for this particular military target, 10 people are okay. But for that other target, 100 seems fine. A calculation that is not just absurd or inhumane or cruel, it is logically impossible to assess. And that logical impossibility seems to gradually fade into simply a requirement of an existence of a military target. Going through the different international law blogs in the past few days, I see a common thread that seems to repeat itself. Everybody asserts the proportionality principle and asserts that the loss of human life cannot be excessive to the military target. But then we shift to assessments of claims about the presence of a Hamas operative here, or a tunnel under that particular hospital, or someone who's hiding in a refugee camp, without assessing how many lives are acceptable collateral damage for that operative or that tunnel. Thus, inevitably, the proportionality principle is emptied of its balancing pretense and is transformed into accepting civilian loss for the mere anticipated presence of a military target. Now, one needs to add to that the introduction of claims of terrorism into the equation, because those claims about fighting terrorist targets and claims about national security, which allows you to make a claim for shielding your intelligence information, the military target is often not even identified and replaced with buzzwords. In this case, Hamas, terrorists, tunnels, without any clarification for us as to what the calculation actually is. Now, one might ask in this situation, what is the purpose of the proportionality test then, if it is that absurd? As a matter of fact, it serves an important purpose in that it can be recalled. It can be asserted and used to discipline and shame whenever necessary, as we see with the atrocities committed in the Ukraine or other instances. In that sense, it's used to activate legal arguments about lack of distinction and lack of proportionality and violations of the laws of war. And that ends up being utilized to activate other equally ambiguous legal tools, such as the doctrine of the responsibility to protect, a doctrine practically reserved to certain states, or a doctrine that might, in this situation, be logically utilized in the Palestinian situation, but also embedded with legal tools that make it impossible to claim if you don't have the might of the Security Council behind you, or the international community, as the international community is actually often understood. Finally, and before turning to the question of genocide and perhaps its special status in terms of accountability, I want to talk about the possible legal avenues against the State of Israel for violations of the right to self-determination and international humanitarian law. Considering Israel's withdrawal of its acceptance of the International Court of Justice's jurisdiction, a case cannot be brought before the court without Israel's consent. Of course, there is always the possibility of seeking non-binding advisory opinions from the court, as with the separation wall advisory opinion, or in the currently pending advisory opinion on the legal consequences arising from the policies and practice of Israel in the occupied Palestinian territories, which is seen by many as an attempt to cover the question that is not covered in the separation wall, which is the legality of the occupation in and of itself. And I just want to mention briefly, so that if you want to keep in touch or keep updated on that, that it was very recently announced by the court that it will be open for public hearings on that particular case in February 2024, which gives you a hint about the time of seeking legal justice, but that's a separate issue. Another issue that arises from the erga omnes nature of the obligations addressed here is that third states have an obligation not to recognize or render aid or assistance to breaches of said obligations, as we said earlier. Does this mean one is faced with a clear case of possible legal avenues against states that assist Israel in its military campaign? The answer is, again, perhaps it depends. One would be faced with two main obstacles if one were to take that route. One is the definition of aid and assistance, and two is the question of indirectly adjudicating third states. International law in its determination of the rules of state responsibility offers a very narrow test for aid or assistance. It requires that a state that provides aid or assistance for a wrongful act has knowledge of the circumstances of the internationally wrongful act, that the aid or assistance must be given with a view to facilitating the commission of the wrongful act, and must actually do so, and that the completed act must be such that it would have been wrongful had it been committed by the assisting state, which again would largely depend on how one reads questions of knowledge, intention, and unlawfulness, and would boil again to the question of who is actually providing the interpretation and who is actually attempting to achieve what. Moreover, another obstacle has been that the court, the International Court of Justice, has generally refrained from adjudicating on facts that affect third states that have not consented to their jurisdiction. Thus, in this case, if one were to sue, let's say, for example, the United Kingdom for its aid or assistance to Israel, the court has this principle, often referred to as the monetary gold principle, at its disposal to rely on. And in its examination of, for example, in its examination of potential violations by Australia on the question of the right to, potential violation of the right to self-determination in East Timor, the court said, whatever the nature of the obligations invoked, the court could not rule on the lawfulness of the conduct of a state when its judgment would imply an evaluation of the lawfulness of the conduct of another state, which is not a party to the case. Where this is so, the court cannot act, even if the right in question is a right erga omnes. Which brings me to the final potential avenue for seeking accountability here, which is genocide. I have kept this as the last issue because Article 9 of the Genocide Convention provides for ICJ jurisdiction on disputes relating to the convention, so potentially creating a space for evading the requirement of consent to seek the jurisdiction of the court. Especially since after 2014, Palestine has also become a party to the convention. So Palestine might want to choose to follow the path taken by the Ukraine against Russia, for example, and file a case. Of course, questions relating to Palestinian statehood and its right to appear before the court might be an issue that is, again, an area for indeterminacy to look at in international law in this situation. But even that might possibly be evaded with a third state bringing a case against Israel on the basis that the commission of genocide is a breach of an erga omnes obligation. We have recently seen the court assert jurisdiction brought by the Gambia against Myanmar in a similar situation. But that would still be faced with the obstacle of proving the perhaps unprovable crime of genocide. Even with individual criminal responsibility, the crime of genocide has proven extremely difficult to establish because of the intent element. The question of the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group is always subject to debate and always depends on the declared intentions of states, regardless of what lies underneath the language that is spoken. So when Israel speaks of targeting Hamas, that is the language of attempting to undermine a genocidal intent. The language always has a subtext against it that is often a legal argument. I want to conclude by saying that considering the indeterminacy of international law and its flippable nature, should one abandon it as a tool of resistance if you know that this tool is much more likely to be effectively utilized by the powerful? What should you do? Abandon it, critique it, use it strategically? I don't think I know how to respond to that question, particularly in moments of crisis, especially if this tool can be used to mitigate loss in the short term, but legitimize dispossession in the long term. It is a difficult question, particularly in the face of the incomprehensible and cruel killing of the Palestinian people. I'm not sure what to say other than to acknowledge that with all the solidarity, it's not my life or my future existence at stake here. Thank you.
I had promised him at the beginning, and I want you to be short, Jason, if you can, because I truly want us to listen to some of the questions and remarks that your interventions have provoked in our audience. So please be kind and accept my haphazard ruling, Jason, that I want you to be shorter than you had expected. Thank you very much. Over to you.
Okay. I want to start by thanking Dean Noha for hosting this event and thanking Lubna and Sherahan for arranging the event. I would like to thank you for coming here. As Dean Noha said, Nazreen gave you a meticulous example of legal analysis. I am not going to do that. In fact, I want to be honest with you and tell you that I don't want to be here. I don't want to be in this room. I don't want to be on this podium. I don't want to be speaking about this issue. Israel is carrying out genocide, and my government, the governments of Europe, and the governments of the United States and Canada are cheering them on. I don't want to offer a legal analysis. I want to protest. I want to scream. I want to cry. I want to curl up in the fetal position. But then last night, I got a call from a Gazan friend, not a friend in Gaza, but a Gazan friend. She's had no contact with the 15 members of her family in Gaza for the last 2 days. Her brother has 6-month-old twins. Her sister-in-law is 8 months pregnant. The chances are, by the time her sister-in-law is ready to give birth, there will be no functional hospitals in Gaza. So far, Israel has wounded 26,000 Gazan people. 10,500 are recorded dead. 4,500 of them are children. That does not include the dead and the dying that are buried under rubble. And it almost certainly does not include those currently dying in northern Gaza and the Gaza Strip. Gaza, as I see it, is an atrocity within a calamity, within a catastrophe. What is happening in Gaza is genocide. There is no difficulty in establishing genocidal conduct, and as I'll show towards the end of my speech, there's no difficulty in establishing genocidal intent. But it's an atrocity that takes place within a calamity, and that calamity, sadly, is the state of Israel. As the Jewish genocide scholar Raz Segal has said, Israel for decades has used the Holocaust to deny, distort, justify, and rationalize mass violence against Palestinians. Israeli violence against Palestinians is a structural, systematic issue that has existed since the creation of the Israeli state. On the 6th of October, 2023, Israel was a settler colonial apartheid state, and international law didn't care. On the 7th of October, 2023, Israel became a settler colonial apartheid state that had been attacked by the natives. On the 8th of October 2023, Israel became a settler colonial apartheid state openly engaged in genocide. But I want you to see that the Israeli genocide in Gaza takes place in a context. The punitive expedition in Gaza is a settler colonial reflux taking place in a wider settler colonial global order. Israel is a settler colonial apartheid state, but it exists in an economic order that we refuse to talk about, an economic order managed by international law, an economic order that kills 50,000 human beings every day, 350,000 human beings a week, 1 million human beings every 3 weeks, 18 million human beings every year. And that is the order that sustains the existence of Israel. It is the order that extends the existence of Europe. It is the order that produces the existence of all of the civilized or overdeveloped worlds. And if you want to understand the callousness of Euro-American leaders right now, look at the world they've created and presided over and see that this is one very small genocide unfolding within another much larger genocide. Thank you.
We will open to hear you now. We're here to learn, to educate ourselves about what are the real issues, and to understand what can we do about it. Jason's final statement was telling us we wake up to understand that Gaza is just reminding us of the much, much bigger homework that your generation will have to deal with, which is produce, first of all, imagine and then produce a much gentler, kinder world than the one our generation is leaving to you. This is a real issue, over and above Gaza and Palestine, though these two are telling us glaringly what the problems are. We are in a global moment of defining nature. Your generation will have to carry this responsibility, and we are here to educate you with fundamentals so that you make smart decisions and hopefully creative, more sustainable solutions. The floor is open. Please.
Thank you very much for a very rich discussion coming from a completely different background. This has been very educational. I have a very naive question. Maybe political science students take that in Political Science 101, but what good is any international law if countries such as the US and others can veto decisions made by majority? Thank you.
Thank you. Let's take a couple of questions. Please go ahead.
Actually, I would also like to say thank you to the brilliant panel for analyzing this brilliantly, and thank you so much for Dr. Jason Beckett for your moving comments. Thank you. Sorry. It's actually a comment/question for Dr. Hani. You were saying that the apartheid started from '67. However, in my research and during my activism for Palestine, there was apartheid starting in 1948 to 67 48 to 66 when the Palestinians inside the supposed Green Line, they were put under military rule. So isn't this considered apartheid? Whereas the Israelis, they were put under civilian law. So, and also I feel like this whole blueprint for genocide, it started back way further than the Balfour Declaration, with the 1878 settlement of Petah Tikva, which was originally Mulabis, which got ethnically cleansed by a bunch of Jewish Zionist merchants, and it dispossessed families like the Abu Hameds, which Israeli historian Roy Marom provided in oral history. That's it.
Thank you. Okay, I have two hands up. We'll take those two. I saw your hand earlier, so I'll take those two hands and then come to another round. Go ahead.
So, of course, I want to say thank you very much to everyone who's come out here. It's really wonderful to hear what you guys have been able to say. I have a question for Dr. Nasreen Badawi in particular, but if anyone else wants to say something, of course, feel free. You're talking about what can international law do, and we're looking at this sort of Jus Cogens violation from Israel in this context. If we look at the measures that international law really features in this sort of place, it's saying, okay, it's just your normal cessation and reparation, but because of Jewish Kogans, it's special. Now anyone can make that claim against you. Do you think that this is what could possibly catalyze the creation of more, the creation of more retributive or punitive measures for enforcement in international law, or is even a calamity to this degree that Dr. Jason Beckett wonderfully illustrates a weird term to use in this context. Anyways, or can even a calamity of this degree not really push international law to ever adopt any punitive or retributive measures?
Thank you. There was a hand there. Please go ahead.
Good evening. First of all, I would like to thank you for the very informative presentations. It's a really hot topic, and we need to be aware of the sensitivity of any comments that's going to be made about this topic. But my question is, I come from a professional background of working on IHL. We already know that we are witnessing a dead system. I will narrow the scope here. Since the 7th of October, is this the death certificate of this system? We all know about the ICJ, the complications of going to the ICJ. We all know the ICC and the complications of going to the ICC. We all know the complications of the national legal systems applying IHL and how this is creating obstacles just to go for this. And they actually tried before to go after Israel and they failed. And it was, in some other cases, it was very easy to go to this system, and it's like on and off. Is it a declaration of the death of this system, or this is a declaration of a birth of a new one? This is actually the question that came to my mind. And thank you very much, Professor Jason, for your moving words.
Thank you for this question. It is definitely a key question, and my quick response before the panel comes is, I hope it's the birth of a new system, and I hope all of you here, the generation that will take that responsibility on, shoulder it very well and create a new system. I have one more question before I return to the panel. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much for that. That was really informative. And I think, building on what you said, and I think something that you've all mentioned, is this agreement that the international system is a failure, pretty much, and is complicit in one way or another, could be complicit if the political powers will it. On the other hand, you see these resistance, the forms of resistance that people are adopting all over the world. People are protesting in these insanely large numbers. You're seeing people come out. People are outraged, rightfully so. In Egypt here, since there's not much room for us to do much, we are posting on social media, and we're feeling like this is how we're doing our part. Some people are trying to boycott, which is honestly, I would like to hear your thoughts on that, since it's a bit murky at this point where all companies are quite multinational and it's all integrated. And how effective is that as a methodology in order to counter what's happening right now? But building on that, I would like to hear your thoughts on how you think moving forward, what would be actually useful for us to work with? And with all of this frustration and all of this outcry that you have all over the world, how can this be utilized into something productive based on your study of history and what you think could work moving forward, since the system itself is failing?
Thank you. Great question, and I hope the panel will focus us on what can possibly be done moving forward. We only have 6 good minutes before we end our session. I will stop here, and I apologize to those of you who still have questions, but this will not be the last panel discussion on this. Over to the panel, and we'll start with Dr. Ibrahim Awad, and then move in the same order.
Thank you very much. I will try to answer the first question, and the question about the death of the system, because I think they are they are related. And I think these are very pertinent questions. I don't think that you can do away with the governance of the international system. I think that what is dead, or what may be dead, is not the international system. It is the governance of the international system. Because I think there should be a distinction between what the international system is and how it is governed, the international system. And it is clear that the crisis is there. And you have indications of that. The United States is extremely, extremely worried in this moment because it has been delegitimized in the United Nations. Even its allies do not vote with the United States. And so something must be done. Something must be done. And this is why this Secretary Blinken is going around. And so I think that we have two ways of acting. To me, the United States is not an honest mediator in the conflict. We cannot go on this farcical peace process. It should go back to the United Nations and to the global governance. Now, as you said, this system of global governance does not work. So I think in conjunction with this, we should work on the reform of the global governance of the international system. This is not something that will happen tomorrow or after tomorrow, but this is a condition sine qua non to advance towards one day a solution. At the same time, we have had in the United Nations General Assembly an expression of the intergovernmental society. But the world civil society, global civil society, has also been active in the last 2 to 3 weeks. There is a rejection of the behavior, of the conduct of Israel. We should work. I don't know who should work exactly, because in our society, civil society is not autonomous. Civil society is not active. Civil society is fought. However, there should be action. I think that the Palestinian community in Palestine and abroad is quite active, and it can produce effects. And I think that also the youth movements in the United States, in Canada, in Europe, there is a lot to be done, and including in Israel itself. Youth and some groups, we should nurture this group. This is a long fight. It's not for tomorrow, but I think that we are in a very critical moment. I think this is a watershed moment, and we should use this. You know, crises are opportunities. So let's turn the crisis into an opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Ibrahim. We only have a few minutes left. Each one of you will take a few minutes to give the message. Go ahead. Well said, Hani. Well said.
I don't think of, I'm a bit skeptical of generalizing and totalizing claim about the failure of the system, because it assumes that there was an original purpose and that purpose somehow had subverted. I think the idea that we think a system is failed is ideological in this Marxist sense of the term. To use the Althusserian language, it's a representation of our imaginary relationship to our real conditions of existence. So to imagine that this system that was actually had a purpose and it actually failed, for me, we need to get out of that. And that's why I'm more interested in understanding historically and genealogically, what did the system do? How does it work? What are the point of weaknesses? And how can I actually exploit them? And so I'm a computer hacker. I need to understand the weakness of the system in order to actually, take control over it. So unapologetically, arrogant. Genocide. I use the word genocide in a very, very important historical sense. The Polish lawyer Raphael Lemkin, when he actually coined the term genocide, when he was describing occupied Europe, often biographies of him and him himself say that he was very much traumatized in his youth by the way the international system dealt with the Armenian genocide that happens in before and slightly after the First World War. So, why is genocide a crime? Well, in a system that is constructed on the basis of understanding that the most important basic unit of it is the nation state, then the killing of a nation becomes the ultimate crime. Okay? So when we say genocide is a crime, we have to understand that it is a crime because we construct a system in which we think that the nation is the most important unit. So the point in this moment of crisis, this is why I say that's our role. War is not my function. My function is to be in a university to ask the difficult questions so that we push the political horizons of what is possible. Is actually, can we imagine a vision of justice that doesn't actually start from nation state and nationalism as the ultimate embodiment of our ideals of justice? So that's why I'm saying it's genocide, because a system like that is going to create that possibility sooner or later. And if we want to think about the future, we need to think about a future that is not based on national territorial sovereignty. Thank you.
All right, I'll be very brief. On the question of use cogens and the potential activation of punitive mechanisms against violations of use cogens, I think the mechanisms are there. They're highly selective. The most obvious mechanism and manifestation is the activation of the notion of the responsibility to protect. So the mechanism is there, but there's also the mechanism that limits your countermeasures to non-performance of acts, that limits you in your ability to respond to violations of use cogens, and that duality is purposeful. So, and that brings me to the question of whether or not the system has failed. Arguably, it hasn't really failed if you're the state of Israel. Arguably, the system is working for certain objectives. And I want to reiterate what Dr. Said said. We need to detach ourselves from the illusion that the system is designed for a particular objective, because perhaps it's not. And that brings me to the last point, which is what can be done about that. I think one important thing one has to consider is to not deny our voices in the process and not to deny our agency as resistance in the process. Often when we assert how power dynamics work in favor of certain actors, it can be very easy to fall in the trap of denying the power of those resisting it as well. And by denying that, we are disarming ourselves. And I think it's important to keep on reclaiming that, even if you acknowledge that the way things are settled are not particularly in your favor. There's one, I think I forgot. So.
Yeah, I don't like doing this, but I'm actually going to disagree with Hani and Nazreen just for once, because I think international law does have a purpose. And I think it's very important when we understand the world that we realize that international law has a purpose. It actually has two purposes. Purpose number one is to regulate colonialism. And purpose number two is to justify colonialism. Now, it's only purpose number two that is failing at the moment. It's okay for Israel to be a colonialist state. All overdeveloped states are colonialist. But Israel has to be a well-behaved colonialist state, and it has currently broken those rules. It is delegitimizing the colonial project that international law is designed to promote and entrench and perpetuate. I don't have time to tell you about the colonial history of international law, but To put it very briefly, it starts in 1550 and it hasn't changed since then. Coming back to the question of what is to be done, there is nothing to be done with or by international law. The system of international governance doesn't rely on the thing that we call international law. It relies on economic coercion, and it's an entirely separate system that we need to consider and talk to. But in the immediate aftermath of genocide just now, I've been reading some speculative but sincere suggestions that if this genocide ends and if there's anyone still alive, that Gaza should be put under international administration. And what I've really confirmed in my head over the last 4 weeks is that whether that's true or not, it's Israel that needs to be put under international administration. And I'll end there.
That is one way of reimagining and thinking out of the box. What you have heard today is that we are at a watershed, so don't let this moment go. Keep thinking, keep studying, keep trying to understand the weakness of the system in order to reconstruct the system, not to disbelieve in systems, but to reconstruct them so that they become more just and more sustainable. Don't forget 2 things you heard today from our excellent panelists. Global civil society is attentive now. This is a moment we should not let go of. Number 2, don't forget, as our panelists have reminded us, Israel is not only committing crimes in Gaza and against the Palestinians for the last 70 years or more, now it is committing a crime of delegitimizing the Western narrative about a rule-based world order. They've crossed the line. This is a moment for us to reimagine a better world order, because Israel has made it glaringly clear that it needs to be fixed. I thank you for being with us. Next November 12th is another conversation where we are trying to understand the positions of the United States and Egypt in this context. Come and join us and bring your friends with you and keep studying and imagining a better future. Thank you.